Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten are climbing out of the tombs. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send the devil of black by you to rip your head off as we did the like button. Unknown horror masters, send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will feed our ghouls. For now, books, albums, websites in the links below. Children of Horror, Legion of Ghouls.
Did I find? Now I dangle as a stocking. Something lurking in the shadows. Something crawls above my head. Creeping, crawling spider near the golden Christmas fire. What gift was brought for you today? What present is in your stocking to slay? I feel the hot breath, death breath drawing near. Spider-Man, the most caress and click by my ear. Icicles of dread, pulse pounding chill of immeasurable fear. Hot spider ooze drips across my bleeding face. Stinging fangs sink deeply, heart burns apace. Creeping, crawling spider near the golden Christmas fire. What gift was brought for you today? What present is in your stocking to slay?
The Weaver in the Vault by Clarkashtonsmith. First published January 1934. A story of the weird and ghastly beautiful horror that came upon the searchers in the eerie tombs of Chennault. The instructions of Fomorg, 59th king of Tassoon, were minutely circumstantial and explicit, and moreover were not to be disobeyed without the incurring of penalties that would make mere death a pleasant thing. Ynor, Grotara, and Thurlane Ludoc, three of the king's hardiest henchmen, riding forth at morn from the palace in Marab, debated with a thin semblance of jocosity whether, in their case, obedience or disobedience would prove the dire evil. The commission they had just received from Fomorg was no less distasteful than singular. They were to visit Chennault, the long-forsaken seat of the kings of Tassoon, lying more than 90 miles to the north of Marab, and descending into the burial vaults beneath the ruined palace, were to find and bring back to Marab whatever remained of the mummy of King Chennault, founder of the dynasty to which Fomorg belonged. No one had entered Chennault for centuries, and the preservation of its dead in the catacombs was uncertain. But even if only the skull of Chennault was left, or the bone of his little finger, or the dust of Mumia into which he had crumbled, the men-at-arms were to fetch it carefully, guarding it like a holy relic. "'Tis an errand for hyenas rather than warriors," grumbled Ynor in his black and spade-shaped beard. "By the god Yululun, keeper of the tombs, I deem it an ill thing to disturb the peaceful dead. And truly, it is not well for men to enter Chennault, where death has made his capital and has gathered all the ghouls to do him homage." The king should have sent his embalmers, opined Grotara. He was the youngest and hugest of the three, being taller by a full head than Ynur or Thurlane Ludak, and like them he was a veteran of savage wars and desperate perils. Yea, I said it was an errand for hyenas, rejoined Ynur. But the king knew well that there were no mortal beings in all Marab, saving ourselves, who would dare to enter the accursed vaults of Cheongaka. 2 centuries ago, King Mandus, wishing to retrieve the golden mirror of Queen Avena for his favorite leman, commanded 2 of his bravos to descend within the vaults, where the mummy of Avena sits enthroned in her separate tomb, holding the mirror in her withered hand. And the bravos went to Cheongaka, but they did not return, and King Mandus, being warned by a soothsayer, made no second attempt to procure the mirror, but contented his leman with another gift. Ynur, thy tales would gladden those who await the scything of the executioner, said Thurlane Ludak, the oldest of the trio, whose brown beard was faded to a hempen hue by desert suns. But I chide thee not. It is common knowledge that the catacombs are ridden with worse hauntings than those of liches or phantoms. Strange devils came there long ago from the mad, unholy desert of Deloth, and I have heard it told that the kings forsook Cheongaka because of certain shadows that appeared at full noon in the palace halls, with no visible form to cast them, and would not depart thereafter, being changeless amid all the changings of the light, and wholly undimmed by the exorcisms of priests and sorcerers. Men say that the flesh of any who dared to touch the shadows or to tread upon them became black and putrid like the flesh of month-old corpses, all in a mere instant. Because of such testing, when one of the shadows came and sat upon his throne, the right hand of King Agmini rotted to the wrist and fell away like the sloughing of a leper, and after that no man would dwell in Cheongaka. Verily, I have heard other stories, said Ynur. The town's abandonment was due mainly to the failure of the wells and cisterns, from which the water vanished following an earthquake that left the land riven with hell-deep chasms. The palace of the kings was sundered to its nethermost vault by one of the chasms, and King Agmini was seized by a violent madness when he inhaled the infernal vapors issuing from the rent, nor was he ever wholly sane in his latter lifetime after the quitting of Cheongaka and the rearing of Marab. Now, that is a tale that I can believe, said Grotara, and surely I must deem that Fomorg has inherited the madness of his forefather, Agmini. Methinks that the royal house of Tassoon rots and totters to its fall. Harlots and sorcerers swarm in the palace of Fomorg like charnel worms. And now, in this Princess Lunalia of Exilak, whom he has taken to wife, he has found a harlot and a witch in one. He has sent us on this errand at the prompting of Lunalia, who desires the mummy of Tenepres for her own unhallowed purpose. Tenepres, I have heard, was a great wizard in his time, and Lunalia would avail herself of the potent virtue of his bones and dust in the brewing of her philters. Pah! I like not the task of such purveyance. There are mummies enow in Marab for the making of potions to madden the queen's lovers. Fomorg is utterly besotted and befooled. Beware, admonished Thurlane Ludak, for Lunalia is a vampire who lusts ever for the young and strong, and thy turn may come next, O Grotara. if fortune brings us back alive from this enterprise. I have seen her watching thee. I would sooner meet with the wild Lamia, protested Gotara in virtuous indignation. Thine aversion would help thee not, said Thurlane Ludak. For I know others who have drunk the potions, but we are now nearing the last wine shop in Marab, and my throat is dusty beforehand with the very thought of this journey. I shall need a whole stoop of wine from Yoros to wash the dust away. Thou sayest sooth, agreed Yonor. Already I have become dry as the mummy of Tenebres. And thou, Rotara? I will quaff any drink, if it be not the filter brew of Queen Lunalia. Mounted on swift, untiring dromedaries, and followed by a fourth camel bearing on its back a light wooden sarcophagus for the accommodation of King Tenebres, the three henchmen had soon left behind them the bright and noisy streets of Marab, and the fields of sesame, the crops of apricot and pomegranate, lying for miles about the city. Before noon, they had parted from the route of caravans and had taken a road that was seldom used by any but lions and jackals. However, the way to Cheon Gaka was plain, for the ruts of olden chariots were still deeply marked in the desert soil, where rain no longer fell at any season. On the first night, they slept beneath the cold and crowding stars, and kept watch by turn lest a lion should come upon them unaware, or a viper should crawl among them for warmth. During the second day, they passed amid steepening hills and deep ravines that retarded their progress. Here, there was no rustling of serpent or lizard, and naught but their own voices and the shuffling of the camels to break the silence that lay upon all things like a mute malediction. Sometimes, on the desiccating tors above them, against the darkly litten sky, they saw the boughs of century-withered cacti, or the boles of trees that immemorial fires had blasted. The second sunset found them in sight of Cheongaka, rearing its dilapidated walls at a distance of less than 5 leagues in a broad open valley, coming then to a wayside shrine of Yakla, the small and grotesque god of laughter, whose influence was believed to be mainly benignant. They were glad to go no farther on that day, but took shelter in the crumbling shrine for fear of the ghouls and devils who might dwell in such vicinage to those accursed ruins. They had brought with them from Marab a wineskin filled with the fervent ruby wine of Yaros, and though the skin was now 3/4 empty, they poured a libation in the twilight of the broken altar, and prayed to Yakla for such protection as he might give them against the demons of the night. They slept on the worn and chilly flags about the altar, watching by turn as before. Krotara, who kept the third watch, beheld at last the paling of the close-hung stars, and aroused his companions in a dawn that was like a sifting of ashes through the cinder-black darkness. After a scanty meal of figs and dried goat flesh, they resumed their journey, guiding their camels down the valley and weaving back and forth on the bouldered slopes. When they came to abysmal rents in the earth and rock, their approach to the ruins was rendered slow and tortuous by such divagations. The way was lined by the stalks of orchard trees that had perished long ago, and by goats and granges where even the hyena no longer made his lair. Because of their many detours, it was hard upon noon when they rode through the hollow ringing streets of the city. Like ragged purple cloaks, the shadows of the ruining houses were drawn close, to their walls and portals. Everywhere the havoc of earthquake was manifest, and the fissured avenues and mounded mansions served to verify the tales that Yunur had heard concerning the reason of the city's abandonment. The palace of the kings, however, was still preeminent above the other buildings. A tumbled pile, it frowned in dark periphery on a low acropolis amid the northern quarter. For the making of this acropolis, a hill of red syenite had been stripped of its covering soil in elder days, and had been hewn to sheer and rounding walls, circled by a road that wound slowly about it to the summit. Following this road and nearing the portals of the courtyard, the henchmen of Fomorg came to a fissure that clove their path from wall to precipice, yawning far in the cliff. The chasm was less than a yard in width, but the dromedaries balked before it. The three dismounted, and leaving the camels to await their return, they leapt lightly across the fissure. Gotara and Thurlane Ludak carrying the sarcophagus, and Yunur bearing the wineskin. They passed beneath the shattered barbican. The great courtyard was heavily strewn with the wreckage of once lofty towers and balconies, over which the warriors climbed with much wariness, eyeing the shadows closely, and loosening their swords in the sheath, as if they were surmounting the barricades of a hidden foe. All three were startled by the pale and naked form of a Colossian female, which they saw reclining on the blocks and rubble in a portico beyond the court. But drawing nearer, they found that the shape was not that of a she-demon, as they had apprehended, but was merely a marble statue that had once stood like a caryatid among the mighty pillars. Following the directions given them by Fomorg, they entered the main hall. Here, beneath the chasmed and collapsing roof, they moved with the utmost caution, fearing that a light jar, a whisper, would bring the suspended ruin upon their heads like an avalanche. Overturned tripods of greening copper, tables and trivets of splintered ebony, and the shards of gaily painted porcelains were mingled with the huge fragments of pedestals and fusts and entablatures, and upon a shivered dais of green, blood-spotted heliotrope, the tarnished silver throne of the kings careened amid the mutilated sphinxes carved from jasper that kept eternal guard beside it. At the farther end of the hall, they found an alcove still unblocked by fallen debris, in which were the stairs that led downward to the catacombs. They paused briefly ere beginning their descent. Yunur applied himself without ceremony to the skin which he carried, and lightened it considerably before giving it into the hands of Thurlane Ludak, who had marked his potations with solicitude. Thurlane Ludak and Gotara drank the remainder of the vintage between them, and the latter did not grumble at the thick lees which fell to his lot. Thus replenished, they lit 3 torches of pitchy terebinth, which they had brought along in the sarcophagus. Yunur led the way, daring the tenebrous depths with drawn sword and a torch flaming smokily in his left hand. His companions followed, bearing the sarcophagus, in which, by raising the hinged lid slightly, they had socketed the other torches. The potent wine of Yorus mounted within them, driving away their shadowy fears and apprehensions. All 3 were seasoned drinkers, and they moved with great care and circumspection, and did not stumble on the dim, uncertain steps. Passing through a series of wine cellars full of cracked and sharded jars, they came at last, after many zigzag plungings of the stairs, to a vast corridor hewn in the nether syenite, below the level of the city streets. It stretched before them through illimitable gloom, its walls unshattered and its roof admitting no crevice-filtered ray. It seemed that they had entered some impregnable citadel of the dead. On the right hand were the tombs of the elder kings. On the left were the sepulchres of the queens, and lateral passages led to a world of subsidiary vaults reserved for other members of the royal family. At the farther end of the main hall, they would find the burial chamber of Tenepres. Yonor, following the right-hand wall, soon came to the first tomb. According to custom, its portals were open and were lower than a man's stature, so that all who entered must bow in humbleness to death. Yonor held his torch to the lintel and read stumblingly the legend graven in the stone, which told that the vault was that of King Ochernil, father of Agmenai.
Verily, he said, we shall find nothing here other than the harmless dead.
Then, the wine he had drunk impelling him to a sort of bravado, he stooped before the portals and thrust his flickering flambeau into the tomb of Ochernil. Surprised, he swore a loud and soldierly oath that made the others drop their burden and crowd behind him. Peering into the square, concatenated chamber, which had a kingly spaciousness, they saw that it was unoccupied by any visible tenant. The tall chair of mystically graven gold and ebony, in which the mummy should have sat crowned and robed as in life, was endorsed against the farther wall on a low dais. In it there lay an empty robe of sable and carmine, and a mitre-shaped crown of silver set with black sapphires, as if the dead king had doffed them and had gone away. Startled, with the wine dying swiftly in their brains, the warriors felt the crawling chill of an unknown mystery. Yonor, however, steeled himself to enter the vault. He examined the shadowy corners. He lifted and shook the raiment of Ochernil, but found no clue to the riddle of the mummy's disappearance. The tomb was clean of dust, and there was no sign nor faintest odor of mortal decay. Yonor rejoined his comrades, and the three eyed one another in eerie consternation. They resumed their exploring of the hall, and Yonor, as he came to the doorway of each tomb, paused before it and thrust his flambeau into the wavering murk, only to discover an empty throne and the cast-off regalia of royalty. There was, it seemed, no reasonable explanation for the vanishing of the mummies, in whose preservation the powerful spices of the Orient had been employed, together with natron, rendering them virtually incorruptible. From the circumstances, it did not appear that they had been removed by human robbers, who would hardly have left behind the precious jewels, fabrics, and metals. And it was even more unlikely that they had been devoured by animals, for in that case the bones would have remained, and the vestments would have been torn and disordered. The mythic terrors of Cheongaka began to assume a darker imminence, and the seekers peered and listened fearfully as they went on in the hushed sepulchral hall. Presently, after they had verified the vacancy of more than a dozen tombs, they saw the glimmering of several steely objects before them on the floor of the corridor. These, on investigation, proved to be 2 swords, 2 helmets, and cuirasses of a slightly antiquated type, such as had formerly been worn by the warriors of Tassoon. They might well have belonged to the unreturning bravos sent by King Mandus to retrieve the mirror of Avena. Yonor, Grotara, and Thurlane Ludak, viewing these sinister relics, were seized by an almost frantic desire to accomplish their errand and regain the sunlight. They hurried on, no longer pausing to inspect the separate tombs and debating as they went the curious problem that would be presented if the mummies sought by Fomorg and Lunalia should have vanished like the others. The king had commanded them to fetch the remains of Tenepres, and they knew that no excuse or explanation of their failure to do this would be accepted. Under such circumstances, their return to Marab would be inadvisable, and the only safety would lie in flight beyond the northern desert, along the route of caravans to Zul, Gasea, or Zilak. It seemed that they traversed an enormous distance among the more ancient vaults. Here, the formation of the stone was softer and more friable, and the earthquake had wrought considerable damage. The floor was littered with detritus. The sides and roof were full of fractures, and some of the chambers had partially fallen in, so that their vacancy was revealed to the casual peering of Ynor and his companions. Nearing the hall's end, they were confronted by a chasm dividing both floor and roof, and slitting the seal and lintel of the last chamber. The gulf was about 4 feet wide, and the torch of Ynor could not disclose its bottom. He found the name of Tenepres on the lintel, whose antique inscription telling the deeds and titles of the king had been sundered in twain by the cataclysm. Then, walking on a narrow ledge, he entered the vault. Rotaro and Thurlane Ludak crowded behind him, leaving the sarcophagus in the hall. The sepulchral throne of Tenepres, overturned and broken, was lying across the fissure that had rifted the whole tomb from side to side. There was no trace of the mummy, which, from the chair's inverted position, had doubtless fallen into those yawning depths in the hour of its overthrow. Before the seekers could voice their disappointment and dismay, the silence about them was broken by a dull rumbling as of distant thunder. The stone trembled beneath their feet, the walls shook and wavered, and the rumbling noise in long, shuddering undulations grew louder and more ominous. The solid floor appeared to rise and flow with a continuous, sickening motion. And then, as they turned to flee, it seemed that the universe came down upon them in a roaring deluge of night and ruin. Rotara, wakening in darkness, was aware of an agonizing burden, as if some monumental shaft were builded on his crushed feet and lower legs. His head throbbed and ached, as if from the stroke of a stunning mace. He found that his arms and body were free, but the pain in his extremities became insufferable, causing him to swoon anew when he tried to drag them from beneath their encumbrance. Terror closed upon him like the clutch of ghoulish fingers as he realized his situation. An earthquake, such as had caused the abandonment of Cheon Gaka, had occurred, and he and his fellows were entombed in the catacombs. He called aloud, repeating the names of Ynor and Thurlane Ludak many times, but there was no groan nor rustle to assure him that they still lived. Reaching out with his right hand, he encountered numerous pieces of rubble. Slewing himself toward them, he found several boulder-sized fragments of stone, and among them a smooth and roundish thing with a sharp ridge in the center, which he knew for the crested helmet worn by one of his companions. Even with the most painful striving, he could reach no farther and was unable to identify the owner. The metal was heavily dented, and the comb was bent as if by the impact of some ponderous mass. In spite of his predicament, the fierce nature of Grotara refused to yield itself to despair. He drew himself to a sitting position, and doubling forward, he contrived to reach the enormous block that had fallen across his nether limbs. He pushed against it with Herculean effort, raging like a trapped lion, but the mass was immovable. For hours, it seemed, He strove as if with some monstrous cackle demon. His frenzy was calmed only by exhaustion. He lay back at length, and the darkness weighed upon him like a live thing, and seemed to gnaw him with fangs of pain and horror. Delirium hovered near, and he thought that he heard a dim and hideous humming far below in the stony bowels of the earth. The noise grew louder, as if ascending from a riven hell. He became aware of a wan, unreal light that wavered above him, disclosing in doubtful glimpses the shattered roof. The light strengthened, and lifting himself a little, he saw that it poured from the earthquake chasm in the floor. It was a light such as he had never seen, a livid luster that was not the reflection of lamp or torch or firebrand. Somehow, as if the senses of hearing and sight were confused, he identified it with the hideous humming. Like a sourceless dawn, the luminosity crept upon the ruin, wrought by the Temblor. Rotara saw that the whole entrance of the tomb and much of its concretion had caved in. A fragment striking him on the head had knocked him senseless, and a huge section of the roof had fallen across his extremities. The bodies of Thurlane Ludak and Ynor were lying close to the broadened chasm. Both, he felt sure, were dead. The grizzled beard of Thurlane Ludak was dark and stiff with blood that had run down from the crushed cranium, and Ynor was half buried in a pile of blocks and detritus from which his torso and left arm were emergent. His torch had burned itself out in his stiffly clutching fingers as if a blackened socket. All this Rotara noted in a dreamlike manner. Then he perceived the real source of the strange illumination. A coldly shining, hueless globe, round as a puffball and large as a human head, had risen from the fissure and was hovering above it like a mimic moon. The thing oscillated with a slight but ceaseless vibratory motion from it, as if caused by this vibration. The heavy humming poured, and the light fell in ever-trembling waves. A dim awe was upon Rotara, but he felt no terror. It seemed that the light and sound were woven upon his senses like some Lethean spell. Rigid he sat, forgetful of his pain and despair, while the globe hovered for a few instants above the chasm, and then floated slowly and horizontally till it hung directly over the upturned features of Ynor. With the same deliberate slowness, the same ceaseless oscillation, it descended upon the face and neck of the dead man, which appeared to melt away like tallow as the globe settled lower and lower. The humming deepened, the globe flamed with an eerier luster, and its death-like pallor was mottled with an impure iris. It swelled and bloated obscenely, while the whole head of the warrior shrank within the helmet, and the plates of his cuirass fell in as if the very torso were shriveling beneath them. Rotara's eyes beheld the horrific vision clearly, but his brain was numbed as if by a merciful hemlock. It was hard to remember, hard to think, but somehow he recalled the empty tombs, the ownerless crowns and vestments, the enigma of the missing mummies, over which he and his companions had puzzled vainly, was not resolved. But the thing that battened upon Ynor was beyond all mortal knowledge or surmise. It was some ghoulish denizen of a netherworld, set free by the demons of earthquake. Now, in the catalepsy that thralled him, he saw the gradual settling of the piled debris in which the legs and hips of Ynur were inhumed. The helmet and body mail were like empty shards. The outflung arm had withered, had shortened, and the very bones were dwindling away, appearing to melt and liquefy. The globe had grown enormous. It was flushed with unclean ruby, like a vampire moon. From it there issued palpable ropes and filaments, pearly, shuddering into strange colors that appeared to fasten themselves to the ruined floor and walls and roof, like the weaving of a spider. Thickly and more thickly they multiplied, forming a curtain between Gotara and the chasm, and falling upon Thurlane Ludoc and himself till he saw the sanguine burning of the globe as through arabesque of baleful opal. Now the web had filled the entire tomb. It ran and glistened with 100 changing hues. It dripped with glories drawn from the spectrum of dissolution. It bloomed with ghostly blossoms and foliages that grew and faded as if by necromancy. The eyes of Gotara were blinded. More and more he was meshed in the weird web, unearthly, chill as the fingers of death. Its gossamers clung and quivered upon his face and hands. He could not tell the duration of the weaving, the term of his enthrallment. Dimly, at last, he beheld the thinning of the luminous threads, the retraction of the trembling arabesque. The globe, a thing of evil beauty, alive and aware in some holocryptic fashion, had risen now from the empty armor of Ynur, diminishing to its former size and putting off its colors of blood and opal. It hung for a little above the chasm. Gotara felt that it was watching him, was watching Thurlane Ludoc. Then, like a satellite of the nether caverns, it fell slowly into the fissure, and the light faded from the tomb and left Gotara in deepening darkness. After that, there were ages of fever, thirst, and madness, of torment and slumber, and recurrent strugglings against the fallen block that held him prisoner. He babbled insanely. He howled like a wolf, or lying supine and silent. He heard the multitudinous muttering voices of ghouls that conspired against him. Gangrening swiftly, his crushed extremities seemed to throb like those of a titan. He drew his sword with the strength of delirium and endeavored to saw himself free at the shins, only to swoon from loss of blood. Awakening feebly and scarce able to lift his head, he saw that the light had returned and heard once more the incessant vibrant humming that filled the vault. His mind was clear, and a weak terror stirred within him, for he knew that the weaver had risen again from the chasm and knew the reason of its coming. He turned his head laboriously and watched the glowing ball as it hung and oscillated, and then came down in leisurely descent on the face of Thurlane Ludoc. Again, he saw it bloat obscenely like a blood-flushed moon, fed with the wasting of the old warrior's body. Again, with dazzled eyes, he beheld the weaving of the web of impure iris, patterned with deathly splendor, veiling the ruinous catacomb with its weird illusions. Again, like a dying beetle, he was meshed in its chill, unearthly strands, and its necromantic flowers, blooming and perishing, latticed the void air above him. But ere the retracting of the web, his delirium came upon him and brought a demon-peopled darkness and the weaver finished its toil unseen and returned unheeded to the chasm. He tossed in the hells of fever, or lay at the black, undivined nadir of oblivion. But death tarried, still aloof, and he lived on by virtue of his youth and giant strength. Once more, toward the end, his senses cleared, and he saw for the third time the unholy light, and heard again the odious humming. The weaver was poised above him, pale, shining, and vibrant, and he knew that it was waiting for him to die. Lifting his sword with weak fingers, he sought to drive it away, but the thing hovered alert and vigilant beyond his reach, and he thought that it watched him like a vulture. The sword dropped from his hand. The luminous horror did not depart. It drew nearer like an eyeless, pertinacious face, and it seemed to follow him, swooping through the ultimate night as he fell deathward. With none to behold the glory of its weaving, with darkness before and after, the weaver spun its final web in the tomb of Necropolis. Thank you for listening.
Have a great night.